Well, on Tuesday, President Obama signed an executive order implementing new, tougher sanctions on Iran. The goal is to increase pressure on Tehran to halt its nuclear program, a program which officials there say is for peaceful purposes. The sanctions were laid out in legislation which passed easily in both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives a few months ago. But let's not forget, there have already been sanctions. And in a report published last week, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon laid out exactly who those sanctions have been impacting the most. The sanctions, he said, have had a significant effects on the general population, including an escalation in inflation, a rise in commodities and energies costs, an increase in the rate of unemployment, and a shortage of necessary items, and that includes medicine. So we want to take a deeper look into the U.S. government's Iran policy. And to help me do that, I'm joined now by Jamal Abdi, Policy Director for the National Iranian American Council. Jamal, connect the dots for me. How does hitting the Iranian people directly lead to an eventual halt of Iran's nuclear program?
It doesn't, is a short answer. But this is something that is supposedly an unintended effect of the sanctions. The people who write these bills, the president who signs them, largely say, we don't want to hurt ordinary Iranians. This is designed to hurt the Iranian government. But you do have a small number of lawmakers and a growing number of lawmakers and pundits on the outside who are starting to come clean and say, actually, this is great when we see that ordinary people are suffering in Iran, when we see the currency devaluation that's hurting the middle class. And the reason they say this is great is because the sanctions aren't designed to address the nuclear issue. The sanctions are designed to topple the Iranian government. And they think that toppling the Iranian government starts with engineering suffering among the people, and that somehow the U.S. is going to convince people to basically take up arms or rise up against the government because of these sanctions.
Is that what you think will happen? I mean, when you have a country that's starving, that's out of work, certainly they're going to get angry. The question is, who will they direct that anger towards?
No, this isn't going to work. We've seen the democracy movement inside of Iran in 2009. This wasn't a movement based on food riots and suffering. These were actually largely middle-class Iranians who had the ability to sort of funnel their attention towards demanding civil liberties, demanding their voting rights and things like that.
But if we look what happened in the Arab Spring, Jamal, I mean, a lot of people say, if you look at Egypt, if you look at Tunisia, that was based on people who are hungry, people who could not, sell their fruits and vegetables in the street. And that did lead to the toppling of a government.
Well, look, you may get a situation in Iran where you have people who attempt to topple the government, whether it's from the outside, this MEK group that has been delisted, or you have this instability that's created. But I would just say two things. One, Iranians have been through revolution. Iranians don't like this regime, but they also understand the instability that comes from toppling a regime. And then the second thing is that if you actually, if this strategy actually worked out, which I actually don't think that people want this strategy to work out, I think they want it to fail so that we can move to a war option. But were this to actually pan out, where there was some sort of instability that toppled the Iranian government, this is not how you produce a democracy. This is not how a democratic government is created. Instead, what we should be doing is...
But has anyone been saying that they're hopeful that democracy will happen in Iran?
I don't know if they thought it out that far. I think a lot of people have claimed that's what they want to see. But if they actually wanted to see that, they would listen to the people inside of Iran who also want democracy and are saying these sanctions are devastating to their cause.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear of just regular non-political business owners who just want to get a loan to fund their business, and they can't get any money from the outside. Again, as you say, some people say this is exactly the goal, but really a whole lot going on here. And we can't undermine the fact, yes, this is all happening under President Obama. On Monday, though, we heard Governor Mitt Romney give a speech in which he outlined his policy, and he made very clear that if he becomes president, his policies would be even more tough. Let's take a listen to what he said.
I will not hesitate to impose new sanctions on Iran, and will tighten the sanctions we currently have. I'll restore the permanent presence of aircraft carrier task forces in both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf. And I'll work with Israel to increase our military assistance and coordination. For the sake of peace, we must make clear to Iran through actions, not just words, that their nuclear pursuit will not be tolerated.
So perhaps, Jamal, this is sort of honing in on what you just said, that not just words, but action. But I'm curious what you think. I mean, what's the big difference between President Obama and Governor Romney when it comes to Iran policy?
If you listen to what the governor just said, this is largely what the Obama administration is already doing. I mean, he won't hesitate to enact sanctions. When has this administration hesitated to enact sanctions? Every 3 weeks you have new sanctions coming online. I think really what separates these two is that the Obama administration has pledged to use diplomacy. That diplomacy, they say, is the way out of this standoff. And with Governor Romney, he has said the same thing, but there seems to be a demonization of the diplomatic option and more of this sort of foreshadowing of a regime change at any cost imposed by the United States that would likely take place via military action.
Now, there are critics of this method of sanctions, and a lot of times they're pointing to historic examples. They're pointing, for example, to Iraq. They say the sanctions didn't take food off Saddam Hussein's table. They didn't make his family live any less large than they did. They point to countries like Burma, Zimbabwe. You know, top leaders there were not directly impacted by sanctions. Only the people are. But you know, why then is there so much support for this? We talked about this legislation passing, I think it was back in August, in the House. That vote was 421 to 6 for further sanctions. So why is there so much support for this method?
You know, it seems like the only thing that Washington and Congress is able to do is pass these sanctions. And the reason is that, you know, you have very powerful groups lobbying for these sanctions. You have groups like AIPAC and United Against Nuclear Iran and Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And because there's not a very strong opposition who's saying, hold on a second, we've done the sanctions, we've reached this inflection point, there needs to be a real investment in diplomacy if we don't want this to go to war. Without that counter voice, members of Congress, people in the Senate, they all seem to think that this is a decision of, you know, all we can do via Iran is more sanctions until the time runs out and we have to go to war.
Finally, Jamal, what is the impact? We talk about the impact on the Iranian people, you know, who have nothing to do with, you know, the policies of their governorship. But what will be the eventual impact if this continues on the U.S. in terms of, you know, geopolitics?
Well, look, long term, the best way out of this is, you know, a negotiated agreement that also creates space inside of Iran so that ordinary people can decide their own destiny for themselves. For the United States, if we continue to do this, we're looking at the same trajectory we had with Saddam, where ordinary people were punished, civil society completely closed up, you had massive humanitarian suffering, and in the end, a dictatorship was actually entrenched, not removed. And eventually, the United States ended up in this disastrous military fiasco. And that's the direction we're heading unless we can figure out how to change course.
Yeah, certainly very interesting. And I think you're right. It's very interesting at a time when this country is so divided that one of the few things they can sort of rally together on is hurting the people of Iran. Very interesting. Jamal Abdi, thanks as always for being on the show. Jamal is the policy director of the National Iranian American Council.